Well, good morning and welcome to Whitney Bible. It is good to be together again. As the kids are being dismissed, just a note, we have our fourth and fifth graders up here to take communion with us, so no class for them, but we are excited to participate in that together at the end of the service. If you would take your Bibles and open with me to Numbers chapter 15. We're going to be covering quite a bit of text this morning, and we won't read it all. We're going to read some, but not all of it, but hopefully it will be beneficial as we continue to kind of make our way through the progression of the narrative as we continue in our study in Numbers. And so I was thinking this week about how to come up with a good introduction, and I'll just tell you what is real life for Michelle and I right now is Brody. So I figured I'd tell you a Brody story. Brody is just over 8 months old now. And so, before Brody entered the picture, Michelle and I would talk often about whatever was going on in life. So on a week like this where kind of working on a sermon and crafting and studying, I would often have conversations with her, and I'm grateful for Michelle. She would never tell you this, but she's a theologian, and I love talking to her about just her insights and her just the unique way that God has given her a mind to think critically. And so we do this now, but we have distraction in our life. And this distraction comes in the form of Brody. I put, so on the left side of the screen, you'll see Brody in his new saucer. He's at that point where he can start standing up on things, but doesn't have the strength to walk. So this has been a great purchase for us, worth every penny to keep him, his head relatively safe. Still some bumps and bruises, just not as many. But he's figured this thing out quick. So Brody can cruise around now. And on the right side of the screen, you see two plants. These are the only two plants that we have in our house. Okay? And my wife is very proud of them. She has worked hard to keep them alive. And Brody's favorite toy of all the things that we own in this house are these plants. And so we've moved them to a number of different locations. So this week we were talking, I had to replicate this because this wasn't the exact setting in which this story took place, but you get the picture. Michelle and I were in the kitchen making dinner, talking about this text and talking really just about the flow of the narrative through the book of Numbers and how it can kind of feel discouraging and where's the benefit and the joy, and we were talking about some of these things and just being honest about it, and yet the saucer is circling our kitchen island and going to the plants, and so we had a chair and we had our dog food crate and we had blocked off everything we could think of to get to these plants. And as we're in this in-depth conversation, we hear enough noise to look over, and he's made his way into the plants again. And so Michelle goes over, and we're frustrated. These leaves have been just stripped bare. Okay, and so Michelle goes and picks him up, and in a little bit of frustration, but it's just the life that we are living right now. She picks him up and gives him a big hug, and then her face turns kind of sour, and she's like, "Oh, you smell poopy." Yes, I just said poopy from the pulpit. But she's hugging him, and she's like, "Oh, you smell poopy, but I still love you," and gives him a big hug, and then she turns to me, and she's like, "Do you think that's how God felt about the Israelites?" My wife is a theologian, and we reflect on these things. But as silly a story as that is, it does capture some of our thinking and our thought process as we're moving through the flow of Numbers. Is these people are stubborn. These people are hard-hearted. These people continue to make bad decision after bad decision. And yet God still loves them. And we're going to see that again today. If you were here with us last week, a couple of our statements that we looked at, one overview statement, which is these two statements are going to be just as true in our text today as they were last week. The first thing was this, that it is tragic when God's people reject his leadership and authority. We're going to see that today as we get into chapter 16. That's where we will spend the bulk of our time as we look at the sin of Korah and this rebellion that ensues. And it is a tragic thing for God's chosen people to continue to rebel time after time after time. That name Korah might sound familiar to you. If you're familiar with this story, certainly, but if you are a reader of the book of Psalms, you might have seen on some of the headings in our Psalms that we have some songs written by the sons of Korah, and we're going to come to that a little bit later. But we do see this tragedy in the rejection of God's leadership. The second thing that is true is that God always stays true to his character and his promises. And we're going to see that primarily in chapters 15 and 17. And as we turn our hearts to communion at the end of the service, hopefully this will resonate with us. Just a review from last week, on the heels of chapters 12 through 14, we see that the spies are sent in to scout the land, and there's 12 spies that go into the land. They're there for 40 days, kind of observing and cruising. Pastor Dan informed us that they went all over the land, which was a big deal, and they saw all that this land had to offer. And while they came back with a positive report, there was much resource. This truly was a land flowing with milk and honey. Their report was also negative because they were unwilling to go take the land. Do you remember why? Because the giants that were there, the people that were undefeatable, that they insisted there was no way that they had any hope. And so 10 of the 12 different spies came back with this report and said, we can't do it. We can't go. And instead, they chose to grumble against Moses and Aaron and God, and the story goes on repeat, right? So when God gives them this consequence at the end of chapter 14, that they were going to instead wander for 40 years, 1 year for each day that the spies were in the land. We see that in chapter 14, verse 34. The promise, that no one of this generation, 20 years and older, would be able to enter the land after this 40-year period of wandering. The people said, okay, well, hold on. Let's just pause for a second. We're going to go and attack them. And God did not give them his blessing to go and attack these people. And so what ensued was a great defeat at the end of chapter 14. And chapter 14 concludes, starting in verse 44, it says this, but the people presumed to go up to the heights of the hill country, and although neither the ark of the covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed out of the camp, then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and defeated them and pursued them even to Hormah. And this is the way that our text ended last week. Not super positive. But God always stays true to his character and his promises. Do you want to know how the next section of our text begins? Look at chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. It says this, then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that you are to inhabit, which I am giving you. And verse 3 continues on to give some really specific instruction. I just want you to pause and think about that for a second. At the end of chapter 14, we just saw this great defeat because the people double rebelled. First, they chose not to go into the land. Then when they decided they didn't want to go wander around the desert for 40 years, they did go into the land without God's blessing. And yet, in chapter 15, verse 1, the Lord speaks to Moses and says, hey, tell the people when they finally do go into the land. Have you paused to think about this? God is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God who is faithful to his promises, even in the pit of disobedience. And we're going to see this, the rest of chapter 15, which we're going to summarize for the sake of time and so that we can get to chapter 16, really goes like this. And I'll just give you, actually, here's our chapter summary. So in chapter 15, what follows are these instructions for sacrifice and sin. That's what I want. Okay. In chapter, all right. And my iPad just crashed. All right, Ralph, you're on. Thank you. Actually, I have a clicker right here. I can take over. So chapter 15, we see these instructions for sacrifice and for sin and for remembrance. And then in chapter 16, we're going to look at Korah's rebellion. That's where we're going to spend a good majority of our time. And then chapter 17, we're going to see this affirmation of Aaron, and we'll get into all of these things. Just to summarize what we see in chapter 15, here is kind of the breakdown of what we want to go into. The first 21 verses will sound familiar to us because we've seen these detailed instructions of proper sacrificial offerings time and time and time again, it feels like. In Leviticus chapters 1 through 7, we spent a lot of time covering the sacrifices. And again, it's repeated in chapters 22 and 23 of Leviticus. And then again in Numbers chapter 7, we see these sacrifices being given special attention. And obviously that shows us that they're important to God, right? But there are some differences in chapter 15. I'm just going to summarize them for the sake of time. But the first thing that we see is in verses 1 through 21. There's this kind of a little bit of a clarification on these sacrifices. One commentator I was reading said this: each of the sacrificed animals was to have an accompanying offering of the portion of fine flour mixed with oil, plus a proportional wine libation. And so he goes into what is added on that we haven't seen yet, along with these different free will offerings and these peace offerings and these festival offerings. None of these first offerings he talks about are related to sin, but they are to free will offerings. And he's saying, hey, tell the people when you go into the land and you're going to make these offerings, there's going to be a new reality for you. Even though this generation, which I'm dealing with for 40 years of wandering, is going to wander around, when the next generation enters the land, there's going to be a new reality that accompanies sacrifice. Not only are you to sacrifice the animals in the way that I've instructed you very specifically, but you're also going to have these different cereal offerings, as some commentators call them. I just put a chart up to kind of summarize. So for a lamb that was offered, there was a certain amount of flour, a certain amount of oil, and a certain amount of wine, which reflects the resources of the land. That's really what I think is being highlighted here. When God gives the people this land, not only are they going to have a land that will keep up with their livestock, but there's going to be flour, there's going to be grain, and there's going to be oil. There's going to be olive trees that they can press and get great oil. And there's going to be wine that can come from the vines of grapes. We saw when the spies came back, what did they bring? A big old bundle of grapes. This land has resources, and God says, I am adding to what already exists. The sacrifices that will be your reality are going to be accompanied with what the land has to offer. And that will be a reality when you enter the land. So that's what we see in the first part of chapter 15. And then concerning sin, God gives some specific instruction, really 3 categories. In verses 23 through 36, you could read it. I would encourage you to read it sometime this week. But basically he says, now, here are some things to remember. When the congregation sins unintentionally, okay? An unintentional national sin that they didn't realize they were sinning, they didn't realize they were breaking God's law, but the whole congregation participated in it. If that was to happen, there's a certain type of sacrifice that would accompany that to make atonement. And then he moves on and he says, for the individual who sins unintentionally, in the second section of where we're at here. And he says, if that's the case, here's what you would do. You would add this sacrifice with some of the cereal offering, and that's how you would take care of that. And then there's a third category, which is to the person who sins intentionally. The text actually calls it a high-handed sin. And maybe you've heard that before. This is the sin of an individual who knows what God teaches, knows what God commands, knows what God expects, and yet they choose rebellion and disobedience instead of submitting to what God has expected. And we think, okay, I don't know if you're like me. As I was kind of working through this, and some of the commentators brought this up, the question that kind of comes to our minds, to my mind, is why is this here? Like in between what we're going to see with the people refusing to go into the land and then going without God's blessing. And then in chapter 16, we're going to see Korah's rebellion, and we're going to read that in depth. Why is this here? And I think it's to show us that God is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God who is true to his word, but has explicit expectation on his chosen people. And he says to the person who refuses to obey, to the person who refuses to submit, there is consequence. And we get to a story that doesn't feel so good to read. A Sabbath breaker who is executed. In verses 32 through 36, it says that some of the people found this guy gathering sticks on the Sabbath, which was clearly a disobedience of what God had given to the people on Mount Sinai. You're not to work on the Sabbath. So the people bring him to Moses and Aaron. They say, we don't know what to do. And so Moses hears from God, and God says, you are to execute him for gathering sticks on the wrong day of the week. But God's expectation is clear. God's information that he has given to the people is without question. There is no question mark as to what was expected and what was done. And God is a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God who says, if you disobey, and if you do it not just accidentally, but if you do it with a high hand, if you do it with a high hand, you can't tell me what to do, God. There is consequence for that person. And that's what we see. And that's how this section ends. And then there's this little tag on at the end of chapter 15, verse 37 to 41, and we won't read it, but God commands Moses to tell the people to make tassels and to wear them as a way to remember. And you still see this to this day. If you go to Israel, you'll see the tassels that are worn by the Orthodox Jewish people as a way to remember. And there's something really cool about that. You know what shocked me as I've been working through this? This idea of remembrance is key in all three of the chapters we're going to cover. And this idea of remembrance is what we're going to observe today. That's the God that we serve, a covenant-making, covenant-keeping God who is true to his promises. But the fact remains that there is consequence to disobey. Jump to chapter 16 with me and read, and I'm going to do something that my homiletics professor in college, homiletics is just how you learn to preach. My homiletics professor told me, never do this, and I'm going to do it. But as we read this passage, I think that this narrative has such action and is written so well that it does better than anything that I could do to summarize it. So we're going to read all of chapter 16 together. I'm reading from the ESV. I would encourage you to follow along with me in your copy of God's Word. And I don't have it on the screen, but oh man, I'm way behind. I'm so sorry. All right. Oh, I went way too far. Right there, that's where I want to be. This is the section of text that we're going to be reading. Chapter 16, starting in verse 1. Now Korah, the son of Izhar, son of Kohath, son of Levi, and Datan and Aviram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Pelet, sons of Reuben, took men. And they rose up before Moses with a number of the people of Israel, 250 chiefs of the congregation, chosen from the assembly, well-known men. And they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron and said to them, you have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? When Moses heard it, he fell on his face. And he said to Korah and all his company, in the morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will bring him near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him. Do this, take censers, Korah, and all his company, and put fire in them, and put incense on them before the Lord tomorrow. And the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the Holy One. You have gone too far, sons of Levi. And Moses said to Korah, hear now, you sons of Levi, it is too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel. to bring you near to himself, to do service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation and to minister to them, and that he has brought you near to him, and all your brothers, the sons of Levi, with you. And would you seek the priesthood also? Therefore it is against the Lord that you and all your company have gathered together. What is Aaron that you grumble against him? I'm going to pause and just kind of give us some context. What seems to be going on here is that Korah and these two other men, actually three mentioned, but we're going to only see Dathan and Aviram are going to be mentioned through the rest of the text. These men kind of gathered a coup of different leaders in the congregation to come up against Moses and Aaron. And it seems like what we read about through verse 11 seems to be that the motivating factor was that they wanted the priesthood. They wanted to be in the position that Aaron as the high priest and his sons as priests and Moses as the mouthpiece of God were operating under. These men were not satisfied with the leadership God had put in place. They wanted it for themselves. That's what we see in the first 11 verses. Let's continue, verse 12. So Moses sent to Dathan and Aviram, the sons of Eliab, and they said, we will not come up. It is a small thing that you have brought us up out of the land flowing with milk and honey. They're talking about Egypt right there. To kill us in the wilderness, that you must also, they were talking about the promised land. That you must also make yourself a prince over us. Verse 14, moreover, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor giving us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Will you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. So they don't respect Moses' authority. Verse 15, and Moses was very angry and said to the Lord, do not respect their offering. I have not taken one donkey from them, and I have not harmed one of them. And Moses said to Korah, be present, you and all your company before the Lord, you and they and Aaron tomorrow, and let every one of you take his censer and put incense on it, and every one of you bring before the Lord his censer, 250 censers, and you also, and Aaron, each to his censer. Verse 18, so every man took his censer and put fire in them, and laid incense on them, and stood at the entrance of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Then Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to the congregation. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell on their faces and said, O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin, and you will be angry with the whole congregation? And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, say to the congregation, get away from the dwelling of Korah and Dathan and Aviram. And Moses rose and went to Dathan and Aviram and to the elders of Israel, and they followed him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, depart, please, from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing of theirs, lest you be swept away with all their sins. So they got away from the dwelling of Korah and Dathan and Aviram. And Dathan and Aviram came out and stood at the door of their tents together with their wives and their sons and their little ones. And Moses said, hereby you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, and that it has not been of my own accord. If these men die, as all men die, or if they are visited by the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up, and all that belongs to them, and they go down to live in Sheol, then you will know that these men have despised the Lord. So Moses is protecting the congregation. He's giving clear instruction that what is to happen if these men are to go on living and die some kind of natural death. That would be proof that Moses was not called by God. But Moses says, if the ground opens up and you go down to Sheol, then you'll know. And he guesses on what happens next. Verse 31. And as soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, and their households, and all the people who belonged to Korah, and all their goods. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive into Sheol, and the earth closed over after them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. Verse 34, and all Israel who were around them fled at their cry, for they said, lest the earth swallow us up. And fire came out from the Lord and consumed the 250 men offering incense. Are you tracking with what's happening? Korah and Dathan and Aviram and all these 250 men who have rebelled against Aaron and Moses and the leadership that God has instilled to the people have been taken care of. I can't help but see the similarity. These 250 men in verse 35, it says, and fire came down and consumed them. Where have we seen that before? Do you remember Leviticus 10 when Aaron's sons offered unauthorized fire? And here again, God is taking care of the same rebellious heart that comes over and over and over. Verse 36 of chapter 16. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, tell Eleazar the son of Aaron, the priest, to take up the censers out of the blaze, then scatter the fire far and wide, for they have become holy. As for the censers of these men who have sinned at the cost of their lives, let them be made into a hammered plate as a covering for the altar, for they offered them before the Lord, and they became holy. Thus they shall be a sign to the people of Israel. Verse 39, so Eleazar the priest took the bronze censers, which those who were burned had offered, and they hammered them out into a covering for the altar, to be a reminder to the people of Israel, so that no outsider who is out of the descendants of Aaron should draw near to burn incense before the Lord, lest he become like Korah and his company, as the Lord said to him through Moses. There's our second reminder. In chapter 15, God said, tie tassels as a reminder, as a way to remember what I'm teaching. And in verse 16, after he takes care of these 250 wicked men, he burns their offering censers. They become holy because of this righteous fire that comes from heaven. And he tells Eleazar the priest, I want you to hammer that out, and I want you to put it on the altar so that every time you look at it, you'll remember. Verse 41 of the text says this, but on the next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron. Can I read that to you one more time? But on the next day, all the congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. And when the congregation had assembled against Moses and Aaron, they turned toward the tent of meeting. And behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. And Moses and Aaron came out to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, get away from the midst of this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. And they fell on their face. And Moses said to Aaron, take your censer and put fire on it from off the altar, and lay incense on it, and carry it quickly to the congregation to make atonement for them. For wrath has gone out from the Lord, and plague has begun. Verse 47, so Aaron took it, as Moses said, and ran into the midst of the assembly. And behold, the plague had already begun among the people. And he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. And he stood between the dead and the living. And the plague was stopped. Now those who died in the plague were 14,700, besides those who died in the affair of Korah. And Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance of the tent of meeting when the plague had stopped. There's a lot that happens in this text. There's a lot of things that should catch our attention, that should be question marks to us, that should cause in us it should invoke a reaction to say, what? Was it right for God? Was it right for the people? Was it right for Moses to do this and that? A couple themes I just want to highlight. We see man's foolishness throughout this text, verses 1 through 3, as Korah builds a rebellion, and in verse 41, as the people blame Moses and Aaron for what transpired. Man, in his sinful state, is a fool. Read the Proverbs. And we see God's justice and judgment Look again at verse 31 to 33. As soon as he had finished speaking all these words, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened, and it swallowed them up. God's judgment and justice. Now, here's where, in my humanity, I read this and think, but did it all have to happen that way? Did you catch that Korah's sons and the sons of Dathan and Aviram, their wives were with them, and their kids were with them? It's hard for us to look at and to wrestle with. But God is a just God. And he shows his justice and his judgment for the sake of these consequences. I think we also see God's mercy. As we are highlighting all throughout the book of Numbers and all throughout the Pentateuch, God's mercy is on full display. In verse 48 and 49, when Aaron stood between the dead and the living, the plague was stopped, and it was a little too late, and God had already killed the entire congregation. No, we see God's mercy in that there were deaths for sure, but Aaron, as the priest to stand in the gap between the dead and the living, rose to the occasion that God responded, that God relented, and he didn't kill everybody. And Aaron, as the high priest of the nation, called and chosen by God, was affirmed in this way. I'll just be honest with you. I found myself lost in a lot of the things written on this chapter in particular this week. The symbolism that might be so apparent of Moses being the intercessor for a people who needed it, and how we can, on this side of the cross, look to Jesus, who was our intercessor, who we so greatly needed. There's some beautiful imagery in there, but just on the basis of this text, what we see is that man is foolish, that God is just, and that he is as equally merciful to a people who do not deserve his mercy. Aren't you glad that that's the God that you serve? I'm sure glad that's the God that I serve. I mentioned earlier the sons of Korah. If you're reading this passage, maybe a question pops into your mind. How do we have sons of Korah? Didn't Korah just fall into the pit? Didn't everybody die that was connected to Korah? If you read the Psalms, you'll see that Psalm 42 and Psalm 44 through 49 and 84 and 85 and 87 and 88 are all ascribed to the sons of Korah. So how do we account for this? This is where our hermeneutic, the way that we read and interpret the Bible, is so important. We recognize that as we preach these texts, we are taking a little bit at a time. But if you were to read all the way through the book of Numbers, if you were to get to Numbers chapter 26 in verse 9, it says this. The sons of, this is a genealogy that's being listed here. Okay, I just want to read it to you because it's important to our story here. The sons of Eliab, Nemuel, Dathan, Aviram, we've heard those names. These are Dathan and Aviram, chosen from the congregation who contended against Moses and Aaron in the company of Korah when they contended against the Lord. And the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up together with Korah when that company died and when the fire devoured 250 men. And they became a warning. But verse 11 gives us a little information we don't have here. Verse 11 says, "But the sons of Korah did not die." And so even though it's not listed here, as we read the account of the entire scroll of Numbers, we are told that the sons of Korah, there's some way where God's mercy is on display in some way that we don't have all the details to, where Korah's sons, for whatever reason, were not consumed in this earth-opening, devouring to Sheol, miraculous judgment of God. God's mercy is evident even in the harshest and the darkest accounts of rebellion and sin. Although God deals justly with Korah and the others, and even their families, God's in the business of preserving a righteous remnant because he's also perfectly merciful. That's what we see over the whole of Scripture. We're going to jump into chapter 17. And I have just kind of this broken up into two different sections. We'll mostly summarize this. It's a short chapter. We could read it all, but I just read a long section. So we'll just summarize this for sake of time. We see, after this whole thing happens, this rebellion, which seems to be directed at the position that Moses and Aaron had in the congregation, and Korah and these 250 men and the other leaders are dealt with, God's next instruction to Moses says, speak to the people of Israel and get from them the staffs, one from each father's house, from all their chiefs according to their father's houses, 12 staffs. So we see as the narrative continues to unfold, God reestablishes communication through Moses to the people and says to the leaders that maintained their role, hey, bring the staff of your tribe. These 12 tribes had chiefs who were in charge, and they carried the staff, apparently, and they were told, bring the staffs to Moses. And what we read in the rest of the chapter is that Moses is told by God to take the 12 staffs, along with Aaron's staff as the leader of the Levites, and to put them all in the tabernacle. It seems to be in the Holy of Holies is where these staffs were placed. And God says, the staff who buds, you will know that staff is the one who I am calling into this role. And any guesses? It was Aaron, right? And we know the story. In fact, if you know some Bible trivia things, if things stick with you in odd ways, sometimes things stick with me. This was one of the 3 items that we're told was in the Holy of Holies, in the Ark of the Covenant from Israel's history as a way to remember. Because after Aaron's staff buds and it's brought out and showed to the people, God says to Moses, take the staff, take the budded staff of Aaron and put it back in the Holy of Holies and leave it there. And we see in verses 1 through 11 that Aaron has this great affirmation to be in the position that God called him to. If you jump to verse 12, and actually I want to read a quick quote that I think summarizes definitely this, but really the whole of what we've been talking about the last 2 weeks. I'll read that in just a second. Jump to verse 12. The end of chapter 17 says, the people of Israel said to Moses, behold, we perish, we are undone, we are all undone. Everyone who comes near to the tabernacle of the Lord shall die. Are we all to perish? It seems like after all of these narrative accounts of the people rebelling, trying to take the leadership role that had been given to Moses and Aaron, and God's judgment of the people as they are judged by going into the ground, and then this reaffirmation in chapter 17 where Aaron is again instituted as and affirmed as the leader, the high priest of the people. The people's response, the response of the congregation is to say, okay, maybe the way that we have been approaching God, and in particular where God's presence dwells, the tabernacle, maybe it's not something that we should be flippant about. Maybe it's not something that we can come and go as we please. Maybe this God who took us out of Egypt and camped us at Sinai and gave us the law and has guided us through fire and through a cloud and done all these miracles and continues to show his judgment, but his mercy, his justice and mercy equally to us. Maybe that God ought to be approached a little differently than we've been approaching him. And I think, at least for a time, there's an indication of an awe on the part of the people to say, this God who has chosen us is not a God to be flippant about. And when we approach, we got to do it the way he instructed. And we have to do it through the leadership pipeline that he has instituted. This quote by Dennis Cole, I thought resonated well with me. I want to read it to you. It says this: sometimes the consequences of sin and rebellion are irreversible, and one must endure the experience of God's judgment before a new course of action brings blessing. I think this is the people. This is the first generation who's going to be wandering and killed off in the desert. That's the consequence. But he continues on, and he says this: sometimes those consequences endure for a lifetime. But even in those settings, we must continue in faith so that our lives reflect redemption rather than further reproach. I wonder if you were to talk to an ancient Israelite who lived during this time and tried to communicate the essence of this quote to them at the end of their life, what they would say to you. Is this true? What about for those of us who have walked with God for a long time? Or maybe for those of us who have walked with God for a very short time, but remember life before him? What about those of us who don't walk with God, who don't yet have a relationship, and seem to be struggling through this stain of sin and brokenness that seems to consume us at every corner? There seems to be a really important lesson for the person who has walked with God for a long time, just as well as for the person who doesn't even know God yet. When we see God rightly, it influences how we are to act, how we are to respond, how we are to live. Only Aaron and the priests were able to enter the tent of God's presence, and only under very specific instruction. And God affirms that through the budding of Aaron's staff, this cool picture of a dead stick that brings from it life. Today we're going to take communion, and I'm struck by these themes of remembrance that are all throughout these chapters. In chapter 15, God tells the people, tie tassels on your garments as a way to remember what I'm doing. In chapter 16, God tells Eleazar, go and take those censers that were used in rebellion. I have burned them. I have made them holy. Now put them on the altar as a way to remember. And then in chapter 17, Aaron's budded stick is taken and put in the Holy of Holies as a way for the nation forever to remember. Seems like God knows the tools that are effective in our lives. And there are some times where we need to remember. And that's why we take communion as a church body. To remember the truth, the reality of what God has done in sending Jesus to this earth to once and for all atone, to once and all be a propitiation for our sins. That's the message of the gospel. God knew we needed a more permanent solution. We don't have to go to the tabernacle or to the temple anymore with our animal. Every time we collectively unintentionally sin or we individually unintentionally sin, we don't have a group of people ready to throw stones at us when we choose to rebel in a hard heart against God. Because a more permanent, more perfect way was through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that's what we remember in communion. In 1 Corinthians 10, there's a warning that's given to us as we prepare to take communion. It says in verse 27, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and the blood of the Lord. Paul writes, let a person examine himself and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment. Communion is an opportunity for us, individually and corporately, to reflect on our relationship with God. How am I doing? How am I doing on unconfessed sin? How am I doing on living in a state of rebellion? Are there things that we need to bring to the Lord? Communion is a great reminder, a way to remember to do that consistently. It's also a great opportunity for us to examine our relationships with other people corporately. How am I doing with other people that I'm doing life with? Maybe there's some unconfessed conflict that's in your life that you need to take care of. This is a reminder. And we know that communion is certainly for those of us who have put our faith in Jesus as our Savior. And so if you're here this morning and visiting, I would encourage you, there's a place for you. We're glad that you're here. But if you haven't yet made that decision to follow Jesus, we just ask that maybe out of respect for this remembrance, you just let the plate go by you. And if there's some things that you want to talk about, we would love to have that conversation with you. But this is for those of us who are part of the family of God because we know Jesus personally as our Lord and Savior. So I'm going to ask us to just take a little bit of time individually to focus on some individual silent prayer. And as we're doing that, I'm going to ask the men that are serving to come and to prepare to serve communion.